Thanks, Stephen, and thanks both Paul and Raf for the opportunity to speak to this audience. I guess by way of introduction, our business was founded in 2016, so relatively new compared to a lot of the businesses here in this audience. Prior to this business, we owned and operated an infant formula business, so we've got a lot of experience in production of powders, particularly specialty powders. That business was eventually sold to one of our major Chinese clients in what they traditionally do is vertically integrate their supply chain. The business was established to effectively export Australian infant formula into China, and they vertically integrated it. We saw the demand in this segment in terms of the plant protein or alternate protein segment off the basis of some of the work we were doing in infant formula in terms of looking at the alternatives to traditional forms of protein. And I guess today what I'd like to cover is just really give you, I guess, a bit of an insider's view to this market segment, just give you an understanding of how we see this segment evolving globally, given it is an emerging market segment, and I guess just to pose how we can and in our firm view will be part of that sustainable growth in terms of cash sustainable growth of agriculture and agribusiness in the future. What I'm going to start with, though, is really a bit of a myth buster, and that is when a lot of people speak about plant protein, they automatically think plant-based meats. They think Beyond, they think Impossible Foods. That market segment is what we would call the sexy end of the market, if you like, and one that's obviously going through quite a lot of consolidation at this point in time. And that consolidation is natural in any emerging industry. In a previous life, I was actually involved in internet technology. I went through the whole .com boom. I saw it firsthand in terms of emerging industries where you have innovators rush, some fall over the edge of the cliff, some just hang on, and then typically, what happens is the void is filled by a lot of the large companies with existing distribution who come in and pick out the key elements of that and move it forward. And we're seeing a very similar scenario in this industry as well. So where we view plant protein is really about the protein transition. So it's about the transition of protein in our diets. And if we look at that from a refrigerator, from a pantry, and then from an out-of-home dining perspective, we're really talking about the percentage of proteins that exist in those products across those categories. And they're changing. The animal versus plant proteins in all of those categories is changing. And it's really changed through a few key drivers. One of the key ones is really choice. It's about the consumer's choice, particularly related to healthy lifestyle, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Regulatory drivers around particularly emissions targets, sustainability targets globally, and that feeds into sort of that necessity to change as well. But it's we don't view it as an either-or scenario. It's really it's a complementary segment. It's a complementary segment that is existing now and will continue to grow. And it's about how we play a role as a country in that segment. So if we look at that transition, and this is some stats I pulled from Boston Consulting. It's just looking about that transition over time as the protein consumption globally increases. What does the mix of that protein look like? And at a base case level, by 2030, we're talking around about 11% of the protein consumed is from what we would call alternate proteins. Upside case, one is 16%, and then sort of that stretched upside case is 22%. So that's a significant part of the global protein consumption is in a form that we're not currently consuming now. So that gives us the opportunity to tap into that market. I think this is also key in terms of consumer attitudes, and I guess the key one here is the stat on the right, which really talks about that belief in terms of healthier lifestyle. People have a belief, and a lot of the consumers already shown this in a number of categories that have grown very quickly, such as plant-based milks, that consumption of a plant-based protein just makes them feel better about what they're putting into their body, gives them the mindset in terms of the type of protein they're consuming, and that's a very big focus for consumers, and a lot of the research comes back with health benefits and perceived health benefits being on top. Regulation, as I mentioned, that this is another key driver. And it's really interesting when I talk to a number of our clients around the world, and one that comes to mind was Friesland Campina, who I met with late last year. The employees I was dealing with there are very proud that their chairman recently made a statement that they're rather than being a traditional dairy company, they now view themselves as a food company with a history in dairy, and very similar to Gunther's comment in terms of Bega, and we see that as part of this transition, as part of the rhetoric in terms of where people are positioning, particularly their brands, to capture this share of the market. So how do we play a role in facilitating this transition? Well, I guess in layman's terms, we take a raw material such as a pulse that exists. We're very good growers of pulses. We're the largest exporter of fava beans, for instance, globally. Pulses, in their very nature, fix nitrogen back into the soil, so they're inherently good for the environment. The farmers obviously use them in a rotational sense to rest fields and add additional nitrogen back into the soil. We've got a long history in growing really quality raw material. So from our perspective, that job's already done. We're simply taking something that our farmers can produce day in, day out. We've got a very diversified geographical landscape of production. So, the key risk for us is, will we run out of supply? That's not an issue for us in terms of the volumes that we're talking. So that's a great place for us to start. And what it enables us to do is apply the technology we developed. We spent the first couple of years in this business developing an extraction technology that really focuses on a highly functional, good tasting, neutral odour, smooth mouthfeel protein that has a broad range of applications. And that's really the key. And that directly relates to the technology we use. And then what we're able to do that is we're able to supply that both locally and globally to our downstream manufacturing partners, who can then create products that are competitive in terms of gives them a competitive edge. So having those combination of elements in our supply chain is really critical. So where does this lead us? So this leads us, and again, this gets back to my point about plant-based not just being about plant-based meat. There's a much broader range of applications for plant-based. So if we look at that particular slide from a refrigeration perspective, plant-based milks is probably the most exciting, plant-based dairy is probably the most exciting category that we're involved in terms of their evolution. If you look at the refrigerators today, the latest figures I've seen is upward of 40% of refrigerators will have a non-dairy milk. That doesn't mean they won't have dairy milk in the refrigerator. They'll also have a non-dairy milk alongside the existing milk. The natural extension to that is plant-based cheeses. We've recently launched a plant-based cheese with Bega that uses our fava bean protein. Plant-based meats obviously is a category we're in, but it's a very specialist category for us, where we're not actually providing a pure protein inclusion, we're providing a functional element. So we're binding and texturizing and adding protein to that. So we're replacing egg white, for instance, or we're replacing a potato protein. So again, specialty ingredient. And then if you look on the right side of that, a whole range of other powder-based products, snacks, bars, spreads, etc. So what that gives us as a business is a very broad customer base. So we're not just reliant on a particular segment, succeeding or failing. We have this ability to be integrated and integrated in a lot of instances in a subliminal scenario across a whole range of these applications. Egg is another great example. I was recently in Japan. Egg allergen in Japan is a significant issue, particularly for children. So they're looking at lots of different options as to how they can reduce their reliance on egg and reduce that impact from an allergen perspective. Lotte, the Korean large corporation, have got one of the largest chocolate manufacturers in Japan. The biggest issue they have is that they have to put on their label that this product may contain eggs when it's just manufactured in a factory that just happens to manufacture biscuits that contain eggs. So if they can eliminate that, they can capture a whole different category within that chocolate business. So there's a whole range of these applications, and we're almost coming across them on a weekly basis where we find the opportunity for a plant-based protein. So why do our customers choose it? Again, getting back to that quality raw materials, the growing conditions, the consistency and reliability, and then the functionality that we provide. So those factors are why we're able to do business with the Danones and Nestle's of the world, where some of our competitors, particularly the Chinese companies, can't, because they can't produce that reliable protein. So if imagine you're putting this in a recipe, you're putting this in a toddler formula, you need the batch-on-batch consistency, you need the functionality, and that's something that a combination of that raw material we can access, our technology, and then our extraction capability gives us the ability to provide on a consistent basis, and that's why our customers choose our product. And in that sense, that's where we take ourselves out of that commodity sales scenario. So we're talking about a specialty food ingredient, as I mentioned, across those categories, where we're not competing with the soys of the world, we're not competing with a lot of the large Canadian producers, etc. So where do we see sustainable growth, particularly in this segment for Australia? It's really about, I guess, adding this value-add step to an existing supply chain. So I guess in our view, we've got this window of opportunity to do that. The Canadians are doing it. Obviously, a number of US companies, European companies, Chinese, etc. There's this opportunity as this market grows and as this market gets embedded into a range of diets globally. There's this opportunity for us as a country to play a role in that supply chain, but we have to have that value-added step, and we have to have the ability to scale through this process. So, as I mentioned, differentiating our product through provenance and that performance in terms of functionality. Building our relationships downstream with customers, so being able to work with our customers on various applications and get them to understand how proteins work in various recipes is really critical as well, because that's when we become what we call sticky in a recipe. Once we're in a recipe, we may only be a 5 or 6% inclusion rate, but once we're there, we're very difficult to displace, because it's an entire NPD R&D cycle for a company like Nestle to go through, which is an expensive process to find another protein that they may want to replace us with. So once we're there, it's a long-term relationship, and it's one that we can leverage. And then off the back of that, and it's about building that capacity to be able to service that market as well. So we have to, given it's a 24 to 36 month process to build one of these new facilities, we have to build this capacity ahead of the curve in terms of being able to capture those opportunities downstream, where we're working with multinational and global companies. So that's me. I'll finish there.
Okay, we've got time for perhaps 1 or 2 questions, or we can move on to the panel. But are there any questions in the audience?
I was just, by the way, Tim.
Well, just remind us where you've come from, say, a couple of years ago, and testing or pilot plant volume to your first commercial volume, whatever that is now, and where you might be in 3 or 4 years' time in terms of commercial volume.
Yeah, sure. So 2016, as I mentioned, is when we started. We developed a pilot facility in Werribee on the outskirts of Melbourne, which we still run as our R&D facility now. We did our first scale up in 2020, so we went into a 1,000-tonne production facility in Horsham, so we built that from scratch. We spent the first sort of 12 months of that exploring those opportunities, particularly in the Australian market, for our product across those range of applications that I mentioned. And then the last 12 months or so, we've been building that global market. We've now got an opportunity to extend our capacity into South Australia with an opportunity over there. So we'll take it as a next step to 5,000 tonne per annum output, and then looking at adding additional products such as starch as well. and also looking at some of the upcycled opportunities around canola meal and spent brewers grain, etc. So it sort of transitions in that sense into a broader plant-based ingredients play, leveraging those capabilities we have in that core manufacturing.
Further questions from the audience?
Just had a quick one if I could, Steve. Just on the 24 to 36 month cycle for the next CapEx, sounds like aquaculture to me. So I'm just interested in why it's so long.
It's long because it's, I guess, it could be a lot shorter. 24 to 6 months is probably a stretch. We built our first plant in 18 months. This particular expansion phase, we want to add an additional couple of capabilities such as starch processing and cleaning and splitting. So that's why we're extending that time frame. But core production, if you're talking about a greenfield site, you're talking minimum 18 to 24 months time. So it definitely is about CapEx spend up front to get that capacity.
Okay, further questions? I've got one. Can you unpack a flexitarian for me?
Flexitarian.
I think I might be one. That's why I'm asking.
I heard it. Climatarian's another one. It's it is about the next generation. It's about, but it's also about the people feeding the next generation. If we look at a lot of our product categories, they're aimed at school lunches. It's parents looking at alternate proteins to give their children. It could be a protein pudding that's plant-based. It could be a protein-based bar that's plant-based, etc. A lot of that consumer driver is coming from from that generation, just providing those alternates. The flexitarian component really comes from someone who's almost ambivalent to the protein that they're consuming, as long as they feel that that protein is good for them and good for the environment. And that's a that's a catchphrase. And one of the missteps that the plant-based meat guys will talk about is that sort of focus initially on a particularly unhealthy environment in terms of that burger chain environment. The much better application of a plant-based meat is if I walk into a sushi bar and I want to reach for a sushi roll with either a teriyaki chicken that is traditional chicken or a teriyaki chicken that is plant-based. That consumer is much more inclined to say, I'm in what I perceive as a healthy eating environment. I'm going to reach for the plant-based environment, and that's we're continually seeing that come through in terms of the way people consume this and the environment they consume it.
Thank you. Right, we're having a panel towards the end, so if there's any last, maybe we'll hold the questions, and might catch you up a little bit later. Thanks, Brenda. Thanks for the fascinating update. It's a great pleasure. I'd like to.